Hello everyone, welcome to Thursday's class. For those of you that were here last Thursday, this is going to be an extension of our introduction to rhetorical terms. Today we're going to focus particularly on logical appeals, as well as follow up on our discussion of ancient rhetorical terms, style and memory and delivery will be of particular focus today. Hopefully I'm not going to go nearly as long as I did last online lecture, but I still want to cover this material in detail. This is going to be terminology that emerges frequently in course discussions about reading and in our own writing, right? We're going to be writing persuasive essays. We're going to be looking at how to incorporate research to prove a point and to counteract opponents' propositions in our own writing. So these terms are helpful tools in being persuasive rhetoricians, which is part of our course objective throughout the semester. So instead of memorizing what the ancient Greek terminology might be, I just want to foreground this conversation by saying I'd much rather you take notes in the direction of understanding the operative concepts at play here. All right. So being able to identify how these terms function, what is the motivation behind these different logical appeals, and ultimately how they can be practically employed in your own writing as you conduct your own research and as you put forth arguments throughout the remainder of the course. So lastly, I want to note those of you that are still joining me online, I appreciate you listening to the last lecture and continuing on in that direction with this lecture. For the rest of the class, this is our Thursday meeting. We're doing an asynchronous course for Thursday, so hopefully you're comfortable and we're fortunate that we didn't have to show up and meet in the building today. So this is my presentation of the class material for Thursday, the 20th. So sit back, hopefully I won't bore anyone to tears here, and I'll go ahead and start with the content. So let me, as always, minimize myself a bit into the corner here so you can see the slides. But like I said, picking up where we left off, remember we talked about the features of ancient rhetoric last time we met. And the features of ancient rhetoric compose of these 5 categories. We spent particular time focusing on arrangement because it's subdivided into these 6 steps. And in going over those, I didn't have as much time to go over the remainder of these ancient rhetorical strategies and terms. So I'll do that briefly here. These are not ultimately the most important ideas presented in the lecture. Nevertheless, they are helpful ways of conceptualizing and thinking about your own presentation of arguments. So style is our place that we pick up from last lecture. And style is a term that describes the particular rhetorical flourishes that an argument is made with. So it can often encompass the use of figurative language, as you see some examples here: repetition, metaphor, allusion, right? Some of these ideas should be familiar to you. They're often employed in creative writing, and great rhetoricians use them and leverage their effect to persuade their reader or their audience of the point that they're trying to propagate and push forward. So repetition, you can think of MLK's "I have a dream" speech, using that phrase to great effect in repetition. Metaphor, right? We talked about this last session, where we are comparing something and we're doing so in a way that doesn't use like or as, which would be a simile. So if we say he is a lightning bolt or he is a cheetah around the track, we're not comparing that using like or as. We're saying he literally is that thing, but the understood meaning of that expression is saying that the individual moves so quickly around the track, it resembles this comparative item. Okay. Allusion, when you allude to something, right? We might reference some pop culture in a speech or an essay or something like that. We might allude to a certain event, some shared collective knowledge about a particular topic. And the list goes on, right? Figurative language is not embodied just by these three examples. Figurative language is quite an expansive category, right? You can think of alliteration here, which is even further subdivided into consonants and assonants. Consonants being the repetition of consonant sounds, assonants being the repetition of vowel sounds. When you hear Billy, Bob, built boats, right? That should ring in your ears as an alliteration. You're seeing that repetition of a similar B sound, right? So these are just examples of how you can add stylistic flourishes. Each individual is going to have a different approach to the incorporation of figurative language. Some speeches might rely heavily on figurative language to emphasize their point. They might employ understatement, personification. They might use simile. They might use automatopoeia, using actual words to represent sounds. So some speeches, some essays might heavily lean into figurative language in their style. Some speeches or essays might focus on one particular element of figurative language, and some might not rely as heavily upon these strategies. Okay, it doesn't make either one of these particularly better than the other at persuading their audience. It's about attuning your figurative language to the group of individuals you wish to convince of your point. So measuring the level of figurative language and how it's employed can be another helpful strategy in the way you think about your own style. You'll develop your own style as you participate as a scholar in research, and you'll develop your own style in inter-class dialogue and conversation as we enact our seminars regarding the course reading. So style is not something to be hyper concerned about or focused on the front end of the course, but it's something you should see develop in yourself as the semester continues. Memory, again, this is not the most critical turn in our lecture today, but I want to highlight it here because it is something that the ancient Greeks and Romans thought was quite important in debate and in persuasive writing and speaking. Memory is the ability to extend your knowledge, oftentimes of poetry, aphorisms, factual information, into an actual argument. So if we think back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, even into up until the 19th, 20th century, some of the factual information that we are very comfortable accessing through the internet was not as easily available. So having poems, having quotes memorized was an incredibly effective tool for the ancient rhetorician, even the pre-modern rhetorician. Okay, so memory was something that received quite a bit of value at the time that rhetoric was developing, but with the extension of the internet into each person's daily lives, memorization of rote facts and information is not nearly as important as maybe it once was. So don't get too hung up on being able to memorize and articulate your reading responses, let's say, for a class seminar. Rather, I would much prefer you to have a few key concepts committed to memory, right? So being able to articulate and understand a few central ideas to the claims that you're making will indeed prove valuable, even in the internet age. Being able to recall quickly the points that you're trying to make, being able to access certain empirical data points that support your claim at a moment's notice will be helpful. That being said, this is not the most important thing that you can do. Having a strong argument and foregrounding that through some of the other methods and strategies we've talked about will be your best bet for succeeding, especially in written persuasive essays. So I want to flag this here again as something that can just further accelerate and enhance your capacity for persuasive rhetoric. When you have items memorized, that quick recall can increase the confidence in your audience or your reader to the knowledge at hand, right? When you can quickly disseminate that information without having to rely on a Google search or the internet or facts on a note sheet. Okay, but especially when we're conducting our final research papers, memorization is not going to be a requirement. It's not something I'm looking for or assessing. It's just something that can help further your rhetoric skills, especially in class dialogue. So delivery is the final term of our rhetorical strategies that come to us from the ancient Greeks and Romans. Delivery is the means by which the argument is actually transmitted. Now, that might seem rudimentary at first, but I think it's actually quite an important and perhaps overlooked step in the way we conceive and conceptualize rhetorical arguments. So a speech is one modality in which something can be delivered persuasively, but it can also be an essay, as we'll be doing in our course. Radio broadcast is another great example. Pop culture, social media, these are all avenues through which persuasive rhetoric can emerge. And they have important advantages and disadvantages. In a tweet that you post trying to convince someone of a particular, let's say, political position, you're limited by the amount of characters Twitter provides for the single tweet. So the depth of nuance, the amount of logical appeals that can be encompassed in that tweet might be severely hampered or limited compared to the length and detail you can get into with an essay. But with writing a tweet, you get that out immediately and you have an open access platform to persuade anyone who comes across that message. As with an essay, that might be a more limited audience. The scope of your argument might not expand beyond a particular point and lose some of its transmissibility. Okay, so each one of these modalities has very different advantages and disadvantages, and thinking about how we want to present our arguments is a helpful strategy in the way we construct them. If you're constructing an argument for a social media post, if you are working on a radio broadcast ad, these modalities are going to look very different. If you were to, let's say, do a visual ad on a TV spot, or you have one of those like obnoxious 5-minute personal ads on YouTube that seem to last forever. Okay, so each one of these modalities has very particular rules and parameters for the way your argument is constructed. In some, you might want to get to the point as quickly as possible. In others, you might want to build up to the point, relying heavily on ethos and logos to get to that conclusion, while in other scenarios, that might not be as prudent. Okay. Also, the act of giving your argument is particularly important. So let's say we're giving a speech, the actual body language, what we do with our hands, which is always like awkward question, how do we move and negotiate our hands in conversation? If you've watched some of these before, I don't know how to act on camera, so my hands are kind of always just flying all over the place. But the body language, the tone of voice, right, the inflection of your pitch can have significant impact in the emphasis you put on certain words, phrases, and ideas. The presentation aids, right? I'm not just speaking kind of into the void here. On my camera, I have a presentation aid. I have a slide deck that y'all can see and access while I'm talking. So these are just a few examples of the practical realities of the delivery in your persuasive speeches or a persuasive essay could incorporate charts and figures that heavily imply the logos of your argument. They give the empirical data that you're using to persuade, right? Your essay could also kind of fluctuate in tone, right? Tone of voice doesn't necessarily imply spoken voice. It could also be the voice of your paper. Are you coming off as reprimanding? Are you coming off as generous? Are you coming off and intentionally trying to situate your tone as one of solidarity, let's say? Each one of those has their advantages and disadvantages to the particular argument and the time and place in which the argument is constructed. So that's delivery, something to think about as you begin your foray into rhetorical thinking and persuasion. So, rhetorical appeals. These might be quite familiar to most of you. I think they're covered at the high school level. They also might have been covered in English 101. If you haven't heard of any of them, don't fret. We're going to go over them step by step. If you haven't heard about them, hopefully I can provide a deeper understanding and knowledge of how each one of these looks practically and give examples and strategies for remembering their utility. Additionally, the logos, ethos, and pathos appeals are probably most commonly taught. And if you are familiar with logical appeals, these are the ones that frequently are remembered and emerge in our understanding of what a logical appeal is. This final one, karos, however you pronounce the Greek, is one that sometimes gets left off of the logical appeals, but is nevertheless important. So I'm introducing that perhaps for the first time to some of you. And I created this kind of like quick little cheat sheet slide. If you want to really learn these terms and ingrain them into your memory, it might be helpful to just copy this down. But logos you can think of as the actual logic of the argument, okay? So that could be your empirical data. That could be you pointing out sequences of logical reasoning that get you to the point you've derived. But logos, and the name implies the logic of the argument, they look quite similar, so that might be fairly easy to remember. This appeals to kind of the mental faculties of the individual reading or hearing your persuasive piece, and you're leveraging data or logic, kind of like the mathematical reality, let's say, of the situation to make your point. Ethos kind of has a similar structure to it as ethics, and when we think about ethics, we can often think about credibility, right? What is trustworthiness? What does it mean to be a individual of virtue and character? This all lends itself to the ethos appeal. Now, ethos is, like I mentioned, establishing the credence of the presenter. So this could look like someone saying, as a doctor, I recommend, that you get enough sun on a daily basis, enough vitamin D, right? As a doctor, I recommend you drink X amount of water per day. I guess it's like eight is it cups or quarts or something like that? I'm not entirely sure the recommended daily dose of water, but I think you understand where I'm going here. Ethos is the appeal to credibility. Like, why should we take this seriously? You can think of the pretty infamous or famous Colgate ads or toothpaste ads where 4 and 5 dentists recommend, or 8 and 10 dentists recommend Colgate toothpaste as their number one choice for toothpaste, right? So the advertisement is relying heavily on ethos. The credibility of the dentists is what determines the reliability of the product, of the actual argument. All right, so establishing credibility is quite important. Pathos, we can think of this as kind of the emotion of the argument, although it might be a little bit more complicated than reducing it down to emotion, which we'll look at. But for the time being, and in shorthand, emotion is a great way of conceiving of pathos, right? When you allude to the fact that there's a sentimental or emotional quality to the argument that you've put forward. You're enacting pathos. Okay, so if we say, you know, freedom has a price, and while that is difficult, you know, a bit of sacrifice can lead to more, you know, extension and protection of freedoms and liberties, and we think those are good things and we value them, so we should be thankful of those that sacrifice, right? We're appealing to the emotion of the situation. We're using kind of like non-quantitative terms to discuss a particular rhetorical situation in which your argument puts forward emotion as the main appeal to why someone should believe what you're saying. Now, pathos can also, you know, work in maybe a negative fashion. Fear and fear mongering is a very effective rhetorical tool, using pathos as a central driving appeal, right? You know, if fossil fuels are allowed to continue indefinitely, then you can say goodbye to your loved ones. The planet is going to be completely uninhabitable, right? That's an argument based on pathos. You're drawing a conclusion based on a set number of facts, which, you know, might entail logos as an appeal, but to kiss your loved ones goodbye because this is the end is clearly an appeal to pathos, right? You are using the emotion of the situation, the gravity of the situation, to elicit fear in your audience so that they might take your perspective seriously and ultimately act upon the action that you've concluded they should act upon. Kairos is this final Greek term that I'm going to present you with, and this is about the timeliness of the argument, right? So when I say timeliness, this is situational. This is when the argument should actually appear. You can see this all in advertising. It's also a reference to the context. When is the context appropriate for a particular argument? We're going to talk about that in a moment when we go over each one of these in a bit more depth. But I'm going to start off with logos, which again is probably the most immediately recognizable logical appeal. And logos is derivative of this Greek word for word, okay? So it also is giving an implication of the actual logic of the terms in which we're dealing with an argument or something persuasive. And it focuses attention on the message itself. Like, what are the parameters of the message? How is it supported by existing evidence, whether that be empirical evidence, whether that be experiential evidence, right? It doesn't entirely need to always be mathematically chart-based evidence. It could also be, you know, someone's own experience as evidence of the message that's being purported to convey. But we can think of this as kind of like the appeal to reason. Again, the mental faculties come into discussion here. How are we actually reasoning with our audience or our reader? Why should they be convinced, given the facts on the ground? What is it that is convincing them to accept the position that you put forward? Again, frequently uses data to support its claim. Now, while this wasn't the most popular tactic in the ancient Greek and Roman times, where rhetoric saw its impetus in a world ruled by empirical data, this frequently provides a leverage point for someone's claim. It also works in the rebuttal section. Appeals to logos can appear in the refutation of your opposition's logic. If you tease out and pick apart why they are inadequate in convincing the reader or audience of their position, then you've appealed to logos, right? You've broken down the sequence of logic into steps that don't cohere. Has little to do with emotion or credibility. It's purely the facts on the ground, what makes sense with this. Ethos, like I mentioned, comes to us from Greek as well, and we can think of this as kind of like the character of the argument. So looking at trustworthiness and establishing trustworthiness, building it up, is quite an immense feat, especially if you are completely unfamiliar with this term ethos. But I want to pay a little bit of attention to it here, and talk about the particular ways in which a writer does show ethos. Right? How do they appeal to their credibility? They might do it through their tone, if it's a commanding tone, if it's one filled with confidence in the situation, then yeah, they're appealing to ethos there. If you are trying to demonstrate the facts on the ground in a particular argument, and let's say you have no expertise, you're just writing about it and you think it's fascinating and worth hearing, well, then your appeal to character might result in a explication of the researchers you've incorporated. Okay, so by doing so, you've established why the evidence you've chosen is worth considering. That can sometimes circumnavigate the need for the individual writer to have a strong grasp of their untrustworthiness with the audience, because they've effectively demonstrated that the sources they're deriving from are trustworthy. Okay. Other times, this can obviously apply in advertising. I gave the Colgate example. Now we need to be careful, and I'll just flag this for a brief moment here before I move on to the final logical appeals. But just appealing to authority figures is not sufficient for making an argument legitimate, right? I want to be clear here. As we cover logical fallacies in weeks to come, the appeal to authority is a very common and often misunderstood logical fallacy, where you link the expertise in a particular subfield to the legitimacy of an argument, right? So if you say that 4 out of 5 dentists say that Colgate toothpaste prevents cavities more than anyone else, okay, you have effectively appealed to ethos, and you've appealed to the credibility and trustworthiness of the dentist, because their profession would involve the examination of many different types of toothpaste. So if they're recommending it and they work in that field, then by all means, that's a great thing. But when we erroneously appeal to authority as a logical fallacy, we are basically saying that Colgate is the best way to treat cavities, or Colgate is the best toothpaste because these individuals have said so. Just because an expert says something does not mean it is true. Colgate might be horrible for your teeth, even if 4 out of 5 dentists say it's true. So we might break our effective logical arguing by erroneously appealing to authority when its relevance to the argument moves beyond ethos. Establishing credibility, good, important, effective. But appealing to authority as the reason the argument should be taken as legitimate and valid is a bit dubious, as we'll explore further on. Pathos can kind of be defined as a couple different things in our transliteration, but suffering or experience get rather close at the root of this definition here. As I mentioned on a previous slide, emotion is also often thought alongside pathos, but I like suffering and experience as well, because there's a sense of like shared ownership to pathos. It can often appeal to the audience's or the reader's capacity for empathy when you tell your reader or your audience, don't worry, we're all in this together. We're all working in this direction. You're using pathos to convey the importance of the gathering, right? Everyone's in this together. There's a shared sense of empathy around a situation or a particular problem. It also can continually work on advocating and improving the values and beliefs of the intended audience. So maybe a example of pathos can look like a speech, right? In which they say, if you value your pet dog, then you should value the life of a pig or a cow and not eat meat, right? That is an argument built on pathos. They're appealing to the values and beliefs of their audience. If they have a pet dog, well, then why would you eat a pig if it's just as smart as the dog? And if it feels the same amount of pain as a dog, then why have bacon strips in the morning and pet your dog at night and think nothing of it? Okay, so pathos is the way we do those types of appeals and those types of arguments. It's important to note here that our mental capacities are stimulated by appeals to logos and ethos as they center our attention to the logic of the situation, the credibility, and the actual data and argument itself. But pathos works on kind of a different playing field. It investigates and pushes into our imaginations and feelings and helps us grapple with the terms of the debate, and ultimately will give us strategies to apply them in the practical reality that we return to. So pathos is incredibly important. It's very difficult to have an effective argument without an appeal to a shared sense of experience or even suffering, for that matter. It's even more difficult or impossible to make an effective argument that has no emotional tenor to it. If we're rattling off facts one after one and we never stop to consider how the individuals in the crowd or the individual readers will respond to the facts with effective appeal to pathos, then we've done a disservice to the argument and we have been short-sighted in our ability to persuade. All right, last slide for today. Kairos is our final logical appeal, and we can think of it as kind of like the season, the opportunity, the right time. These are all effective words to describe Kairos. And this is a reflection of the timeliness of the argument. It is heavily reliant upon context. We can see this in advertising quite a bit, where the appropriate tone and structure need to coalesce and convince the reader or the television watcher, wherever the ad is playing, that it is an effective product. And if those elements are not aligned, then we might have a completely sound and rational argument, but it'll be lost on the context in which it's presented. So I give an example here. Donald Rumsfeld, kind of like former disgraced member of Bush's time during the Iraq War, who went on to promote this Churchill-themed solitaire game, right? And let's say he wanted to promote this Churchill-themed solitaire game in the pages of Teen Vogue. Now, do we think that's an effective appeal to Kairos or an ineffective appeal to Kairos? I venture to say it's probably ineffective. First of all, members reading Teen Vogue are probably not old enough to really remember Donald Rumsfeld as a political and kind of like military figure. They also are probably not as interested in solitaire as maybe an older demographic might be. And finally, the kind of like Churchill theme behind the solitaire game could lose its appeal if the readers are teenagers as opposed to, historians, retired historians, let's say, as another demographic. So would it be better to run this ad in Teen Vogue, or would it be better to run this ad on the Military History channel? Okay, it seems like the Military History channel would be a much more effective place for this advertisement to run than in the folds of Teen Vogue. So that's just a small example, and hopefully an illustrative one, that demonstrates the timeliness and the context in which an argument appears, and the effect it has on the end result of whether your audience agrees with the project you've put forward, or whether the reader understands the point that is coming across, whether that's trying to convince someone to buy a product, or whether that's someone trying to convince someone to believe a particular way about the world through your argument, right? So Kairos is situational, it's contextual. You also navigate the way in which you employ tone. If you're trying to tell a kindergartner why the sky is blue, right? You might not use very fancy and technical terms that we could find in the sciences to make that explanation. But, you know, if a high schooler comes up to you and asks you in earnest, why is the sky blue and why does it change colors during the sunset, right? The explanation you give might be more comfortable exploring terminology outside of the initial question, and provide resources to that student that they can then leverage into their own understanding of the topic at hand. While, you know, the kindergartner, if you dump all those terms on them, try to explain it in the same manner, will look at you like you're clueless. So understanding who the audience is and applying specific parameters around that interaction to make it as effective as possible is a great example of Kairos as a logical appeal. So I believe that is all. So without further ado, I will go ahead and maximize myself, I guess that is, and tell you all to have a great weekend. Look forward to seeing you in class on Tuesday. We're going to be talking more about rhetoric and more about some of these terms, so hopefully everyone is clear and on the same page as we begin really diving into the readings. We'll be talking about logical fallacies in weeks to come, and that should hopefully round out our understanding of rhetorical terminology and the ways in which rhetoric is applied both outside, kind of like in practice, and the way we could apply these terms to rhetoric in our own demonstration, whether it is in class dialogue and conversation or whether that's in our final research essay. Okay. All right, everyone, take care. I'll sign off here.